Hi everybody, Fran here at New Testament Explained. This video is going to run through the extract in Ian Wilson's Jesus the Evidence that appears as Anthology 9 if you are studying Edexcel A-Level Religious Studies. I'm going to break down what Ian Wilson says in that extract and also draw out some strengths and weaknesses. Starting first with a little bit of context. Ian Wilson is a history graduate from the University of Oxford, and he specialises in writing about historical and religious mysteries, including the Turin Shroud. And his association with such topics has meant that he hasn't been taken seriously as a scholar. In terms of the book we're looking at, Jesus the Evidence, this was written to accompany a television series which had the same title. And in terms of the approach that Wilson takes when writing Jesus the Evidence, he takes a historical approach and investigates the resurrection as a mystery to be solved. And somewhat similar to Morrison, a section of this text is going to see Wilson research and analyse naturalistic explanations that have been used to explore what could have happened to Jesus and why the tomb was empty. So the first area that Wilson explores is the location of the tomb that Jesus was buried in. The first thing he does is he tells us what we can learn about this tomb in the Gospels. So the fact that Joseph of Arimathea provided this tomb, the fact that it's a new rock-cut tomb, the fact that no one had been buried in it yet, the fact that it's in a garden close to Golgotha, and the fact that there was a very big stone rolled across the entranceway. And what Wilson adds to these different Bible passages is the fact that there are more than 60 examples of such rolling stone tombs in and around Jerusalem. There is one element of this broader description that Wilson then looks at in particular detail, and that is the fact that no one had yet been buried in this tomb. And he asks the question of, well, why is it important to mention this? Why do the Gospel writers mention this fact? Does it really matter? And he looks at archaeology to make the point that it does. So he draws in on excavations at Givat ha-Miftar to show that when it comes to tombs, a single Jewish tomb might contain one or more benches, that there might also be 8 or more chambers to accommodate ossuaries, and that each ossuary itself might have several sets of bones inside of it. And he uses this excavation to prove the point that there could be up to 30 or more people buried in a tomb over a period of time. And what that means is that it is quite important that Jesus is buried in a tomb in which no one had yet been buried. That point is actually quite interesting. From this point, Wilson looks at different locations that have been considered the burial site of Jesus, and the place he spends more time exploring is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, this location has been considered the burial site of Jesus since around 4 AD, which was when Helena, the mother of Emperor Constantine the Great, apparently discovered it. Now, when Helena discovered this site, it had a mound of earth on it, it had a temple on it, and therefore Helena had this site essentially cleared. And in this location, she did discover 3 crosses and the titulus. What's quite interesting about this location is that, according to the Gospels, Jesus' tomb was outside of Jerusalem's walls. However, by the time that Helena went to Jerusalem, these walls had been rebuilt and the tomb now laid within the walls of Jerusalem. So there's a bit of a shift from how the Gospels describe the location as compared to what the actual situation was at the time when Helena discovered it. There are things that have happened to this tomb that have had an impact, and one of those changes is that Constantine the Great's engineers cut away the rock and essentially this tomb has been subject to attacks, and essentially this location doesn't look how you would expect the tomb of Jesus to look, and it doesn't look like it would have at the time of Jesus' burial, and that's had quite a big impact on this site and whether people believe it to be the burial site of Jesus. It's at this point that many Christian pilgrims turned to a different location that looked more authentic and looked how you would imagine the tomb of Jesus to look, and this is called the Garden Tomb. And yes, we've essentially had a shift from that point, that now people consider the Garden Tomb to be the resting place of Jesus after he died because it looks more authentic. In terms of strengths and weaknesses of Wilson and what he says in this section of the extract, he is putting the resurrection into a historical context. He's looking at it archaeologically, and that should be considered a strength. However, a weakness is that arguably he doesn't emphasize enough the issues around the Church of the Holy Sepulchre being the location. In particular, the discovery has been considered a publicity stunt, the fragments of the true cross are largely considered fakes, and you could say that Wilson maybe doesn't dwell on these weaknesses enough in his extract. After looking at the potential locations of Jesus' tomb, Wilson then has an area of this extract where he looks at the inconsistencies across the gospel narratives. And what I've done to make this perhaps a bit easier to process is I've created a table where down the left hand side we've got the different topics, if you like, that Wilson covers. So which women went to the tomb, what was seen at the tomb, and where did Jesus reappear. And then across the top I've got the different Gospels, and what you can see just reading this table, and this is a point that Wilson draws upon, is the fact that the Gospel narratives are very different to each other. Different women go to the tomb, what was seen at the tomb differs, and then we've also got differences when it comes to where Jesus reappears, whether that be Galilee as in Matthew and Mark, or Jerusalem as in Luke and John. The next section of this extract is much more similar to what we see in the Morrison extract, which is Anthology 8 if you're studying Edexcel A-level religious studies. Here, Wilson identifies different naturalistic explanations for the resurrection, and he tells us why they are inadequate. What's interesting here, though, is that the first four theories that he puts forward, so the women went to the wrong tomb, an independent person removed the body, the disciples removed the body and invented the story, and the disciples hallucinated, he groups these four theories together and says, quite clear is that the disciples and gospel writers anticipated that the first four theories would be proposed to explain the mystery. So he groups these together and talks about them quite quickly, to be honest. So what I've done on this table is giving you a summary of how Wilson discredits these four theories. So in terms of the women going to the wrong tomb, his counter-argument is the synoptic writers emphasise how the women carefully took note of where Jesus was laid, and also it would have been easy for any skeptic to go to the right location, see that the body's there, and put the issue to rest. In terms of an independent person removing the body, John's Gospel puts into the mind of Mary Magdalene the idea that the man she mistook for the gardener, who was actually an unrecognised Jesus, had for some reason taken the body. And perhaps a bigger point here is that someone at some point would have probably produced the body if it had been removed. In terms of the disciples removing the body and inventing the story, the writer of Matthew accuses the Jews of having bribed the guards posted at Jesus' tomb to say this, and like with the last reason, at some point somebody would have produced the body if this was the case. And when it comes to the disciples hallucinating, both Luke and John's Gospel emphasise the fact that Jesus had resurrected, whether it be through him eating fish or through the wombs being touched. And again, this fails to account for the real emptiness of Jesus' tomb. It doesn't explain, that fact if the disciples hallucinated. I have put this fifth naturalistic explanation on a slide by itself, and this is to really emphasise the point that Wilson spends a disproportionate amount of time looking at it. This theory is that Jesus did not die on the cross, commonly known as swoon theory. I've not detailed everything he says about swoon theory, but he spends a lot of time looking at it and putting forward all the different scholars and what they say about swoon theory, which is quite interesting. It's very interesting that he spends so much time looking at this theory, considering that he then comes to the conclusion that it's not an adequate explanation. Another interesting point is that in terms of his rebuttal, his counter-argument, he actually uses a different scholar. He uses this quote on the slide by David Strauss to say, actually, it is highly unlikely that Jesus didn't die on the cross. And then when we come to strengths and weaknesses then of this section of the extract, even though Wilson does spend a lot of time looking at swoon theory, he is critical of it. He doesn't believe it to be an adequate explanation, and he does use historical evidence about the nature of the crucifixion to dismiss it. In terms of the weakness though, you can't help but notice the fact that he just spends so much time looking at swoon theory, and you could argue by consequence he doesn't pay enough attention to theories that might be a little bit more convincing or at least be worth a deeper discussion. The fact that he clumps 4 reasons together and talks about them all together and quite quickly, it just raises a few questions about where he's put his priorities in writing this extract. There is a reason why he could have done this. It could be because the TV series that accompanies it obviously needs to be eye-catching, it needs to draw in an audience, and swoon theory is a theory that will probably draw in an audience. So that is a potential explanation, but again, it's just reading this bit of the extract, it feels a bit odd in terms of what is talking about more, what is talking about less. In this last section of the extract, Wilson tells us why he thinks Jesus did resurrect. And this is a difference when compared to Morrison. Morrison counter-argues against different naturalistic theories, but then the extract that we read as Anthology 8 ends, and we have to sort of deduce the fact that Morrison thinks Jesus must have therefore resurrected. However, Wilson here is giving us something to work with, is telling us why he thinks Jesus did resurrect. The first reason that he gives is the sheer confidence of Simon Peter, and he uses 2 speeches to back this up. The first is the first post-crucifixion public speech, and the second is a similar speech made later down the line to non-Jews in Caesarea. The second reason he gives is St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, in which St. Paul tells the reader that he had seen the resurrected Jesus, Simon Peter had, other disciples had, and 500 people had. So again, he's trying to emphasize the scale of people who had seen the resurrected Jesus, and even adds that most of whom he claimed to still be alive when he was setting pen to papyrus. So he's saying not only did all these people see the resurrected Jesus, but many of them are still about today. And finally, Wilson gives a reason concerning Stephen, who is one of the first new believers and is a Hellenistic Jew. Now, Stephen will go on to attack the material vanity of the temple in Jerusalem, and he will also accuse Jerusalem temple authorities of having executed Jesus and therefore having murdered the great prophet foretold by Moses. So we have got sort of 3 points that Wilson uses to support his thesis that Jesus did resurrect. Now, in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of his thesis, of how he backs it up at this point, a strength is that he presents the case that the transformation of the lives of Simon Peter and other disciples, it explains the resurrection. It proves that it is likely that Jesus did resurrect. However, a weakness here is that Wilson doesn't prove the resurrection itself happening. He's just saying because the resurrection led to so many people having strong faith and accepting persecution, then it must be likely that he did resurrect. But there is a key issue here that none of this evidence is actual proof that Jesus resurrected. It's just saying that the faith people had in the aftermath suggests that he did. And that's something that is quite important. That then ends my video on Wilson and the extract that appears in Anthology 9 if you are studying Edexcel A-Level Religious Studies. As always, thank you for watching and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already.